On my right, I have Emily Rauhala. She's the China correspondent for the Washington Post, previously the Beijing correspondent for Time, and also an editor at Time magazine in Hong Kong. She has a decade of reporting experience from East and Southeast Asia. She's covered China's rise on the world stage, of course, authoritarianism at home, and she has won Overseas Press Club Awards for writing on the internet in China, and other awards from the Human Rights Press Awards, Society of Publishers in Asia, and International China Journalists Association. So thank you, Emily. We have Megha Rajagopalan, who is the China Bureau Chief for BuzzFeed News. Megha has covered stories across Asia, from the Philippines to illicit trade in North Korea. Previously a political correspondent for Reuters in Beijing. She was a Fulbright Fellow, Research Fellow at the New America Foundation, and her work has appeared in leading publications, New York Times, Time, and so on. Then we have Giles Hewitt, who is the Editor-in-Chief, Asia Pacific, for Agence France Presse. He started with AFP in 1990. He has held postings across the world, including as the correspondent in Beijing, before going back to the headquarters in Paris. He's done postings in New Delhi as Deputy Bureau Chief, New York, and then back to Paris, and various assignments through India and back. He was, importantly, the AFP's sole Bureau Chief with responsibility for North Korea when they opened a bureau there in September of 2016. And Giles took up his current post as Asia Chief Editor in Hong Kong in 2017. Then from Singapore, we have Kirsten Han, a Singapore freelance journalist who specializes in social justice, human rights, politics, democracy. She's the editor-in-chief of New Narrative. Her stories and commentaries have appeared in publications like The Guardian, The New York Times, Washington Post, and so on. She's covered topics such as labor exploitation, LGBT equality, and free speech. As an activist, Kirsten advocates for an end to the death penalty in Singapore, and she's a founding member of the abolitionist group We Believe in Second Chances, and she was in the news in a big way in Singapore this week, which hopefully we can talk about. We then have our Star TV correspondent, Ivan Watson. He's a senior international correspondent based in Hong Kong since 2014, covering all of the big stories in the Asia-Pacific region. He was based in Istanbul, Turkey for the previous 5 years. Ivan has covered stories around the world. He played a key role covering the Hong Kong umbrella revolution here. Back in 2014, he's reported on the devastation and struggle for survival in the Philippines after Typhoon Haiyan, and from Cairo's Tahrir Square during the Arab uprising. He was part of the CNN's award-winning team of reporters who covered the earthquake in Haiti, and has held assignments across the Middle East, covering ethnic and sectarian cleansing by ISIS. Then, last but not least, we have Ben Bland, South China correspondent for the Financial Times, author of Generation HK, Seeking Identity in China's Shadow, published by Penguin. Ben has been an FT correspondent around Asia, Indonesia, Vietnam, and before that he was with the Daily Telegraph in London. He's a graduate of Cambridge University and SOAS in London. Long intros, but thank you all so much for giving us your time. Okay, so I'll crack on. We're very fortunate to have two panelists who've flown in from Beijing, and China is obviously the dominant story in Asia. It's the biggest generator of news, the biggest powerhouse per se. And so, Emily, the first question I'd like to turn to you will be on China. Can you just detail, as a frontline correspondent, some of the working conditions in China? Can you explain how difficult it is, the restrictions they put on you, and how hard it is to get to the bottom of the story up there? Thank you.
Sure. Thank you for having us, and thanks to all of you for coming. I've had some really interesting conversations with other panelists and guests today, and it's really an honor, so thank you. I've been working based out of Beijing for the last 5 years, and so I'll primarily speak about operating as a foreign correspondent in China. Clearly there's another side to this, which is the conditions facing Chinese journalists operating in China. I won't speak that much to that since it's not my area of expertise in my experience, but just to acknowledge that that is an important, entire separate area. I think when we're talking about the ability to get a story in China right now, there's three elements. One is the Chinese journalists who are working with foreign media. The second is the correspondents themselves, and the third is the impact on your sources. And on all of those three fronts, over the last 3 years, I've seen a very serious decline. To some extent, it's never been easy or safe, particularly to report in the mainland. There's sometimes a tendency to say this is the worst time, but when we talk to the old-timers, they confirm that things are indeed pretty bad. I'll briefly mention examples in each category and then move on to the esteemed panelists. In terms of our Chinese colleagues who work with foreign media, I think this is an area that's been pretty consistently bad, so it's hard to gauge levels of badness, from quite bad to continuously quite bad. Examples from the last 5 years, reporting in Xinjiang, went up to my hotel room. My colleague went to his room, and he was harassed with 74 calls over the evening. They threatened to take his family's farm. They knew all about his relatives. In the last year, we've had one colleague harassed by Chinese state security. Conditions for foreign correspondents, I think, are relatively good. That's probably not a popular thing to say. Relatively good, I guess, emphasis on relatively, is particularly for those who hold foreign passports. There's lots of pushing and shoving, but nothing quite as severe as we see among our peers elsewhere in conflict areas and in Southeast Asia in particular. The biggest change I've seen over the last 5 years, and perhaps the most worrying in terms of our actual ability to do our jobs, is sources. We've seen a narrowing of who we can talk to. In 2013, 2014, you could call up most Chinese academics and talk about their life's work, what they've been working on, and you just can't do that anymore. So at the same time the Chinese government's asking us to tell the China story well, we're limited in who we can talk to. And I think the real threat of getting someone arrested is something that we're thinking about every day. I know I do. And I know I'm walking away from stories because I don't feel like they're safe to report.
Megha, do you want to expand on your experience in China and what you're seeing at the moment?
Yeah, I agree with everything Emily just said. I just add on a couple of things. I'm a member on the board of the FCCC, which is this organization's counterpart in Beijing. And I think one of the troubling trends we've seen is just like pressure on visas for foreign correspondents. And that's not new. That has been the case for a few years. But I think where it differs now is that like a few years ago, if somebody's visa were to be not renewed or something, it would become a news story because it was, it was an aberration. But now it's like we see this happens, so often that it's not even notable anymore. And also news organizations don't want to come forward about it publicly because they don't want to jeopardize, the possibility of getting visas in the future and things like that. So it's sort of like, maybe a quieter or like more insidious way to put pressure. And we've also heard more reports of people saying that, they've gotten messages that the renewal of their visas are directly tied to their organization's coverage. Sometimes not even the reporter's coverage, but the organization more broadly. So that's certainly a problem. Yeah.
Okay. Lots of issues raised there from China alone, which we'll come back to. But I want to broaden it out beyond China, maybe bring in Giles, if you don't mind. You've got this Pan-Asia senior editor role heading up AFP here. Giles, I know one point you made to me before we were chatting is that perhaps somewhere like North Korea might seem like a really difficult place to report from. But in some respects, the rules of the game are almost understood because what you see is what you get. Whereas other countries that perhaps on the exterior might be more press-friendly, on the ground can be quite difficult. I hope I've characterized that fairly. Do you want to expand on what your staff experience and what your views are about this issue of authoritarianism across the region?
Yeah, sure. I think, first of all, it is tough to report out of North Korea. It doesn't just seem to be. It really is very difficult. But I think what's perhaps interesting for a discussion like this is the difference between, if we're talking about journalists working in authoritarian regimes, is those countries where it's challenging, frustrating, and difficult to report, and those where it's downright dangerous. And I think, strangely, North Korea are put in the former camp. It's a very frustrating place to work. You don't have any access to people, to places, to information. It's very, very restricted, very tightly controlled. But the rules of engagement, if you like, are very clear. And for an agency like us, who have a bureau there, we have a team that we send in on a regular basis. It's always the same people. They're very experienced. They know the people they're dealing with, and they know where they can push and where they have to stand back. So from my point of view as a sort of editor in the region, and I'm having to talk to teams and send them out into different places, I don't really get terribly anxious about our people who go to North Korea. Sometimes the communications can be bad there, and they don't contact us for a couple of days, but I don't lose sleep over it. Where it does become difficult is in countries where the ground rules shift unpredictably. And that's especially true in sort of democracies or nominal democracies in some cases that have started to flirt with or totally embrace authoritarianism. And I'm thinking, I suppose, of places like the Philippines under Duterte, Cambodia under Hun Sen, even, the Maldives under Abdullah Yameen. We sent, I mean, that's funny. We have a mission in North Korea now, and I didn't really talk to them before they went. Whereas we sent 2 Indian journalists to the Maldives in February because there was unrest there. And they were picked up, interrogated, detained. They were questioned about being spies, and we were terrified of what was going to happen to them. We really had no idea because we weren't very clear about the situation in the Maldives at that stage. They were from India. They weren't sure either. And in fact, they were detained and then they were deported and sent back to India the next day, and everything was okay. But it's that uncertainty that really fuels anxiety and worry, I think. Myanmar is one of the really obvious examples at the moment. I think we've had a long presence in Myanmar. Under the military rule, it was a bit, well, it wasn't quite like North Korea, but it was quite clear. The rules were clear in how it worked. I think since it became a sort of quasi-democracy, we expected things to get a lot better, and I think journalists felt that they could start to experiment and start to write about different things. And then you see what happens to the Reuters journalists recently, and that really shocked our local journalists there, our team there. They were terribly surprised that it happened, and they were very, very worried about it because they suddenly thought, well, we're not quite sure now. Where do the rules lie? What can we do? So when we're discussing, well, we might take a trip to Rakhine State to do a story about the Rohingya crisis, we have long discussions with them about what do you think? And they go, well, we really don't know. We're not sure if this is a good place to go at this time. We're worried about going there and what the reaction might be. The Philippines has always been quite a difficult place, I think. But under Duterte, it's become difficult because he seems to act on a whim. He just targets people. He names media groups. He names individual journalists, condemns them, says they should be killed or whatever the term. And they become very, very vulnerable. I think we're going to speak later on, perhaps, about the thing you mentioned about the local reporter versus a foreign journalist. I think that's very important in that sort of situation. The foreign journalist really does have a get-out-of-jail card up to a point, whereas local journalists much more vulnerable under that situation, I think. But yes, that's our experience. I think these rigidly authoritarian countries, and there can't be many more authoritarian than North Korea, actually you sort of know where you stand in one way or another, but it's still very difficult to operate. Where it gets dangerous for our people and where we start to worry about them, we have more discussions, is these places where the sands shift a bit and it suddenly turns authoritarian and then nobody really knows where they stand. That becomes very difficult for us.
Thank you, Charles. Now, I'd like to bring in Ivan from CNN because we have, fortunate to have an example of all of this caught on video. Now, I know, Ivan, you've experienced worse, but we have this clip, which I just thought we'd play to the audience to give a sense of what we're talking about, and then I'll come.
It has been the most turbulent year in a decade of Turkey's political history. Clashes week after week, month after month in Istanbul and in other cities that resulted in the deaths of 2 more people just last week here in Istanbul. The country more polarized, perhaps, than I've ever seen it. The government has succeeded in winning an election last March decisively, but there's clearly a significant portion of the Turkish population that's not happy with the policies of the democratically elected government. And if you ever needed proof, just look at the police presence in central Istanbul, in the commercial capital. This is all to prevent people from being able to lay flowers in a park where the protest movement first erupted a year ago. Errol.
And Ivan, as you're speaking to us, we're going between what you're showing us and other live pictures of the area at the moment. Where does this go from here? Because what essentially we're seeing is that the police are out in such force, people can't respectfully and calmly and peacefully voice their opinions in Istanbul.
Well, the cycle that we've seen over and over again is that people will try to come out, chant, wave some flags, and very quickly the police crack down and use force. And then often you get clashes erupting, demonstrators throwing rocks bottles, and police cracking down with their use of force as well.
Are you journalists?
So,
Just a minute.
excuse me.
Come here, please. Are you journalists?
We're, I think I'm
please.
getting...
Passport, please. Just a minute.
I think we're, I'm
Just
being...
a minute. Just a minute. May
okay.
I see your passport,
So, Errol,
please? Which canal? Which canal? Which canal?
CNN.
See
CNN.
your passport?
Of course tonight. Okay. Okay.
Okay, can I see your passport?
Yeah. So, Errol, we're now being
and
checked.
journalist card. Please,
Okay, I have
journalist card. Can I
Journalist
see your
card right
journalist
here.
card? Just
Anyway,
a
this
minute.
is my press card. It allows
Okay.
me
Where is your
to...
passport?
It allows
Where
me
is
to
your
work
passport?
in
Where is
Turkey.
your passport? Go with me. Where is your
okay.
passport? Okay,
I did-
come with us.
Okay. I know you've experienced worse, but that was a graphic example of what we're talking about. So can you just tell us what happened when you went off air there with those security forces? How did you get out of it, and similar experiences you've had?
We were still on air, and as they were pulling me off, somebody kneed me in the butt, and eventually they didn't let us turn the machine off. This wasn't a big deal, so to speak. Journalists like us are knocked around by police and detained and questioned all over the place. The difference here was this was a live broadcast, so it raised questions from viewers, and we had to explain subsequently what was going on and why this happened. If I get pulled aside by police all the time in various countries, but because it was live, it kind of heightened what happened there. But all of us have had experiences that are far scarier and far more physical with security forces. But another difference in this situation here, and we were detained for maybe a half hour or so. They claimed that my press card could have been counterfeited. That year was my 12th year working and being based in Turkey. And what happened in that moment was a clear, I think, effort by the authorities to establish a new red line and a warning to foreign journalists. I had been able to operate broadcast live next to the police as long as I was respectful in so many altercations for years, but they clearly made a point at that point, you're not allowed to do this kind of thing anymore. And they eventually let us go. But a few days later, the Turkish Prime Minister at the time, Recep Tayyip Erdogan, now he's the president, he doubled down on this and on the floor of the parliament called me an agent and said I was out to try to hurt the country. And that was part of a new policy that had begun where he started targeting foreign news organizations in Turkey. So we saw a drift towards this authoritarianism that had already been setting in against Turkish journalists who'd been rounded up. You know, it's a famous jailer of journalists. But now they were starting to go after and target foreign journalists and basically accuse them of being agents and perhaps a precursor of this term we've gotten to know, fake news disseminators. That is a common tactic of every authoritarian regime that I've reported from and in. The big change that I think we've seen over the last year is to see a US president routinely accusing journalists like us who get this harassment, who get this treatment, and certainly our local counterparts, our fixers, our local producers and so on, to then be targeted from a US president's perspective, which we've kind of relied on for protection when we're operating in places like Turkey, China, what have you.
And Ivan, you mentioned an experience with your email in Libya, your pre-correspondence. Do you have any recollections of what happened to your email in terms of how it was interfered with?
This was during, and I'm just checking the years again because the brain cells have kind of died since then. But this was August of 2011. It was my second trip to Libya, but this was during the NATO-led bombing campaign and around the time of the Arab Spring. So you had an uprising against Muammar Gaddafi. That was one of the most authoritarian countries that I'd reported in up until that point. So you had an active war on top of a very paranoid system that was essentially a police state. And all the foreign journalists were confined in a luxury hotel. It was a very nice place. But, you know, we were subject to harassment by our minders. We were being bussed around the war zone and shown protests in support of Gaddafi and so on. And I was getting hauled in by the government officials on a pretty frequent basis and being yelled at and accused of killing Libyans because I was not reporting numbers at protests that they liked. And I was getting fed up with the harassment, and I kind of knew that something was going on with our computers and our phone calls and stuff, and I started lobbying for CNN to pull us out. We had reporters at that time with the rebels in different locations around Libya that had taken over territory, and my argument was if they're going to be threatening us, which is what I was starting to get from them, and I was in their gilded kind of prison at that point, let's get out. Because they're using you at some point. It is an information war. And then suddenly they kind of eased up on me. I eventually left Tripoli. Some weeks later, Tripoli fell. And my colleagues, it was Matthew Chance and Jumana Karadshe were the team. And they were trapped in the hotel as basically Tripoli fell to the rebels at that point. And there was a lawless, very insecure, frightening period. But eventually, all the government minders disappeared, and the reporters, after all that fear, were able to get into the rooms in the hotel where the government officials worked. And there they found my emails printed up, which was, it kind of confirmed a point. But, that's an example of an authoritarian regime that is on the verge of collapsing, and seeing some of the tactics of how they operate.
That's a pretty graphic example for sure. Kirsten, can I bring you into the discussion? Can you, first of all, because you've actually been in the news this week, can you explain to the audience why you've been in the news and what's happening with your organization in Singapore?
Well, I've been in the news over the past couple of weeks for a couple of reasons. Firstly, because I was before a select committee on deliberate online falsehoods, which is a really nice technical way of saying fake news. Giving evidence as a witness to this committee that was supposedly gathering feedback and on what to do, what the Singapore government should do about fake news. And it was supposed to be a consultation that kind of ended up not really being one. It was a little bit more like being on trial, because they would bring up all these, like none of the questions were open questions. It was more like, this happened, would you agree? And then and suddenly they then brought up an article that I'd written and be like, you were misleading in this article, would you agree? And it just kind of went like that. There was a panel of 4 of us and we were there for 5 hours. And then two days later, the managing director of New Narrative, who's a historian, and who was also testifying, was there for 6 hours. And after that, so just the past week, because we applied to register a Singapore subsidiary of the company that publishes New Narrative, which we originally registered in the UK, we applied to start a Singapore subsidiary, which was rejected this past week. And it wasn't just rejected, they put out a press release about rejecting us. And so as far as we know, it's unprecedented. I don't remember any other rejection needing a press release to say that they've been rejected. And they said we were rejected because we were clearly political in nature, New Narrative, because we had published stories critical of regional governments. New Narrative covers not just Singapore, but Southeast Asia. We published stories critical of regional governments. We held offline events like democracy classrooms. So they said, oh, that's political. And then because we had a grant for independent startup journalism, we had a grant from Open Society. They said, that's George Soros money. So they said, they ended their press release with, we cannot allow Singaporeans being used by foreigners to meddle in Singapore politics. So I now get to be a local reporter and a foreign agent at the same time. Yeah. And immediately after that press release, then you get all these comments that come out on Facebook of they're traitors, they should be detained, they should be arrested, they should be hanged, they should be executed slowly for selling out the country. And so it's just been like that for the past few days. The day after the press release, there was this huge full-page spread with really huge photos of my managing director and I, and then juxtaposed next to a photo of George Soros, whom we've never met, of course. And the key players, this company and George Soros and what he does and how he meddles. And yeah, so that's what we're dealing with at the moment.
But they haven't. The website hasn't been shut down or anything. And
the website hasn't been shut down. So they've refused to register the Singapore subsidiary, but because the parent company is in the UK and the parent company publishes New Narrative, so we're still kind of seeking legal advice as to what it means moving forward, but we're just going to keep publishing for as long as we can.
Sure. Okay. Well, Ben, I bring you in. You've been waiting patiently down there. I want to start going through some of the issues that have been raised, and one of the points brought up by some of the panelists was about protecting local colleagues. At least foreign correspondents have a Western passport behind them for some protection. How do you practically look out for your colleagues on the ground, the fixers on the ground that you've hired from that country? How do you go about making sure they don't fall into the wrong side of the law, so to speak?
It's an important point, and it's very difficult. I mean, just to make things clear, I might give you an example of what happens. I'll talk about my experience in Vietnam, where I used to be the FT correspondent. Like China, it's a one-party communist dictatorship, and they actually have a very similar method for managing the foreign press. So as a foreign journalist, you can recruit your own local translator. In Vietnam, it's actually the law that you have to have a local assistant. So you choose someone you want to hire. Then they're actually technically employed through the Foreign Ministry of Vietnam, the same in China. And the Foreign Ministry will then basically pass off handling of those people to the Internal Security Police. And then depending on the assistant, depending on what you report, they will regularly have to meet with the secret police, effectively plainclothes police, and discuss what you've been doing, what you will do, what the local assistant has been doing. And this can lead to a number of difficulties. It really depends on what you're covering. But in Vietnam, in my case, I had my first news assistant came in, was quite naive because I think people in China and Vietnam are not very clear about these power structures and how they work. Most people don't work in the media and they maybe think it's quite a glamorous job. But anyway, the first news assistant came in and was totally cooperative with the police, which I was fine with. I told them, do whatever they ask and that's okay. But then they started, when I came back from meetings to the office, they would ask me, who are you meeting? I need to know who you're meeting. And I said, well, just a source, don't worry about it. And I thought, whatever I do openly is fine. I don't want to tell them people I'm meeting, because I know they'll have to tell the police. It's easier if they don't know. But she got very frustrated. The police kept asking her. She ended up screaming at me, saying, if you won't tell me what you're doing, why should I work with you? In the end, she left, and I understood the pressures she was under. My second news assistant got in an even worse situation, because I told her to cooperate, and she said, no, I'm not against the Communist Party of Vietnam. I'm a loyal citizen, but I don't want to be a police spy. I want to be a news assistant. I want to do interviews. I don't want to meet some guy over coffee and tell him who you're meeting and what we're going to do. So she met them, but didn't give them much information, which really frustrated them. And they basically started a program of what I can only call psychological and, in the end, physical torture. So, they would follow her around. If she had dinner with a friend, they would call her up afterwards and say, why did you go to that restaurant with that guy? What were you talking about? So it's very difficult. It exacts a really high toll on people. And honestly, it's really hard to protect someone. I mean, you can tell them to cooperate, and that might not help them. If they don't cooperate, it doesn't necessarily help them either. So I think you have to just try and be honest about the risks people face. But at the end of the day, the people I work with wanted to do the job. They wanted the experience. They went to it in some senses with their eyes open, but it's really tough. And I think we all have to be mindful of the risks people take, because it's pretty terrifying.
Pretty terrifying. Any of the rest of the panel would like to weigh in on this with your experiences? Mega, have you any?
Yeah, the subject of this panel is authoritarianism, and I guess probably everybody here would agree that there's been this kind of rising tide of authoritarianism in this part of the world, particularly in Southeast Asia. And I think one of the challenges that presents is how to judge these, kind of, in some cases, very quickly changing political climates from the perspective of protecting your local colleagues and also sources. I did a piece in Myanmar, I think 2 years ago now, and I worked with a local journalist, and I didn't end up using his name in the story because of security concern. And at the time, I was thinking, okay, this isn't great. He deserves credit for having worked on the story, and I just didn't really feel great about it. And then he actually did end up being arrested for a period, not related to that story, but it happened about a year after that. And so then I just kind of looked back on that. I was like, well, maybe it was good that I didn't put his name on. But all this stuff, it's like, it's always a judgment call. And if you had asked me at that time, I would have thought, like, there's no real history of people being arrested for doing stories like this. Like, there wasn't like a substantial body of evidence to judge that. And I think that's now true in a lot of places where it wasn't before. In like places like Cambodia, for instance, Thailand, even China, I think the risk profile has substantially changed. So I think the way that I've changed the way I work because of that is like, before I go into a story, I try to really think hard about, like the current status of the environment, like talk to people who are based there and see how they're thinking about it. And then when it comes time to publication, I like reevaluate and think about what I'm going to use and how that's going to impact the people who are quoted and whose names are on the piece.
I think for a place like Singapore, it's a little bit, it's really complicated because it's simultaneously more and less free than people think. So like I meet people who are like, oh, Singapore's like a dictatorship. I was like, no, it's not a dictatorship. And there are a lot of things that actually we can say and do and generally be okay. But also at the same time, then, things happen. So like just in the past week, when you were sending around the pre-email, the questions, and this question about foreign and locals came up, and I actually emailed you back, and I said, no, I have a different perspective as a local, because as a local, there's a lot more I can do than foreign correspondents, because foreign correspondents are worried about their visas, especially if they have spouses who have jobs as well. You don't want to move your whole family all of a sudden. And so I know a lot of foreigners, journalists in Singapore, who have some stories that they just won't touch. But as a local who can't get thrown out, I'll just do them. And so like that to me was freedom. And then I emailed you that. And then the new narrative thing happened, and then I had to email you again and went, wait, I have some other issues now.
Back to where we
because again, they can't throw me out, but I also have nowhere else to go. So it kind of is very difficult, and sometimes you just don't know, like definitely you're right, sometimes you just don't really know what shifts. And like in Singapore, when it's such as, it's like it's a big city, but actually a small island. Things can get personal very fast. Like government officials know you as a person. And like as a freelancer, I don't have any sort of institutional backing. There's not going to be a legal office anywhere who's going to watch out for me. Right? If they come for me, there is no editor, no bureau really kind of responsible for my well-being. So it's just me. And so that becomes a little bit more complex. But then, yeah, I still think that in Singapore, at least, there is some room to maneuver, even if it's because there is a cost that the government might not want to take by like arresting people or disappearing people, because that's really bad for PR. But because there's this cost, then there's some room that we sometimes navigate.
Can I just jump in here? In terms of a city that's both more free and less free than people think, in terms of media freedom, I think we have to give a shout out to Hong Kong, because things here have changed a lot in the last few years, as Selena was saying earlier from HKO1 on another panel. Don't forget 2 or 3 years ago, Hong Kong booksellers who, while not journalists, they were publishers in a broadly similar industry, were kidnapped from here and taken to the mainland. So even here, the rules are changing. And while there's this contradiction in a way that there's still a lot of room, and you've got to use the room before it goes, but at the same time, there's a lot of pressure on that room. So I think it's really difficult decisions that people face. And I think where Giles mentioned uncertainty, I think that's how authoritarianism works. Of course, there are the police who push you around or threaten people or hack your phone and your computer, but a lot of it is just self-censorship in society. And when people feel the pressure, editors are more reluctant, journalists are more reluctant, sources are more reluctant to talk to you. So it's really difficult and really important to use the space while you still have it in places like Hong Kong and Singapore and others where there are some rights you can use and still quite a lot of space.
It's quite a delicate balancing act, that, when especially with the local reporter issue, because we have a lot of local reporters working in difficult countries who are incredibly committed to their work, and they're very brave people, they want to do their jobs. And we have various levels when things become difficult in certain countries of certain precautions we can take, so we can remove bylines. We can sometimes dateline from a country nearby, or we can then eventually we can actually remove the reporter out completely in certain cases. But you can be overprotective, and I remember we had a report we had from a Cambodian journalist of ours, which we thought was very sensitive, and we looked at it and we thought it was a very good story, but it could get him into trouble. So we put it out without his byline on it because we thought that would be helpful. And he called me up, asked me about it, and I went, it's fine, we took your byline off it. And he was furious. I mean, he was just really upset and shouting at me and telling me that I'd done the wrong thing. And it was very difficult because in the end, you're going to always err on the side of caution. But for him, it was something that he'd put a huge amount of effort into. He wanted some certain amount of recognition for, and took great professional pride in. So trying to find that balance between those two things is very hard if you feel responsible for those people.
I totally agree, and I think as journalists and journalism as a profession, we love to celebrate journalism. Less comfortable to talk about is the way that reporting in authoritarian environments makes you complicit in the oppression of others, and that's how an authoritarian state works. What you were saying really resonated because as foreign bureaus in China, to operate there, we are complicit in the unfair treatment of Chinese journalists. So what's the right thing to do? Is it put someone's name at the top, risk getting them thrown in jail when you really can't get them out? Is it always take it off and give them no credit for their work? And the way authoritarian works is they put us in the middle of that and make us make those calls, which are never fair. Another example on this question of complicity, which I think is quite awkward but not talked about enough, is the way that the foreign media handles press conferences in China. The Foreign Press Corps in China, for all of its high-minded rhetoric and self-regard, engages every year in a fake press conference on live television. Like, all the bureaus go to Li Keqiang's pressure and pretend to ask questions. And as journalists, we don't really talk about that. Where's the space to call ourselves on our own bullshit as journalists and to talk about the ways that our operations are sustaining these governments in some ways?
Thanks, Emily. The other side of protecting locals is protecting sources on the ground. Ivan, do you have any thoughts on protecting people who you liaise with, people who talk to you as conduits of information, how you can be sure they don't get caught up by the police and the security forces in your experience around the world?
The last thing that I could live with is somebody getting arrested or worse because they spoke to me and you can't parachute into a place and be too arrogant knowing that somebody that you're working with, a driver or whoever, could suffer some kind of a punishment. So it's something that you constantly have to be aware of. In places like Beijing, we have, I think like the Vietnamese system, editorial assistants who are basically contracted by the state, and there are projects you can work on with them that you feel are somewhat safe, and then there are things that you don't involve them in at all to try to protect them from that. Coming to this thing, I was thinking about this 5 years ago, a few more years ago, we would have talked about the biggest threat to reporters like ourselves, to our colleagues on the ground in various countries, was something like, ISIS people, Al-Qaeda coming out, kidnapping, chopping people's heads off, things like that. Horrific attacks. And I don't know if you guys agree with me, but today it feels like the entire trade is being squeezed by the rise of these authoritarian systems, by these strong men, who some of them still use kidnappings, disappearances at night, killings. But we've also seen, I think, in country after country, using commerce and economic pressure as a way to shut people like us up. Go after the guy who owns our newspaper, our TV channel. Take them out. That's kind of what happened in Russia years ago with Putin. That's what we watched happen in Turkey with a democratically elected government do that, squeeze with tax fines, different kind of media oligarchs, and throw people in prison. And to bring it to the US example, some people are arguing that criticism of Jeff Bezos and Amazon is a way to try to punish that company and its ownership of the Washington Post. Those are slightly more refined ways to tell us to shut the hell up. And what's so striking now, and how this is becoming the new normal, when you go to a country where it's still accepted to be a journalist and it's still accepted to question, South Korea comes up as an example for me, or Japan, where you can literally call government officials up and they're tough questions and they answer them at press conferences. It's almost become unusual for me, right? You're like, wow, it's so great to work here because journalists are not being targeted and aren't considered criminals, but it's really frightening to see how quickly that seems to have shifted. And as we see the rise of these kind of regimes and this behavior, Hungary might be an example, though I haven't been there. You know, we hear talk of Poland and how that's changing there. We're starting to work in a new paradigm, and it's frightening. And we're going to have to make these decisions more and more, how to protect people. And then ultimately, where we have to go to these sham press conferences and, you know, speak in code sometimes if we want to keep working.
Maggie, do you want to expand on the protecting sources aspect in China?
Yeah, I think anonymity, like the ability to give sources anonymity, is really important, and I think it's underappreciated. I think that I've seen a lot of reporting in China where I'll read the piece and it's a great piece, but then they name the source and it's like it's not a dissident. It's not somebody who's already thrust themselves into the spotlight. It'll be a normal person, like, you know, somebody who has lost their land, or you know, perhaps they're living in Tibet or Xinjiang, or you know, like basically involved involuntarily in something sensitive, and that person is named. And it just makes me wonder, like, did the reporter explain to this person what they might be getting themselves into? Like, perhaps it's only a 10% chance that they'll get into trouble with the police. 10% is too much. And there are a lot of news organizations that have very tough policies on anonymity, which is understandable because it does raise a trust issue with the reader, I think. But, like, you know, we give Trump administration officials anonymity every single day. Every news organization does this, senior administration official, right? So why would you give that privilege to somebody who we're supposed to be checking, who's in a position of power, but you deny that privilege to you know, somebody who could really be at risk? So I did a piece on Xinjiang last year, and I referred to everybody by like their first initial. It makes the reporting process a lot harder because you have to get, you know, like a larger mass of sources to corroborate the same thing, because you're not naming someone. Often it involves, like, you know, pushing back against your editors. You have to explain to them why it's important to give anonymity. Like, I mean, in short, it's like the incentive to you as a reporter is not to give anonymity, because, you know, you're going to get in trouble with your boss and, you know, on Twitter when people don't believe your story or whatever. But I think from an ethics perspective, it's really, really important, and I think it's like increasingly important in China specifically.
Thanks, Miguel.
Could I just jump in quickly there? I mean, I think it is a really important thing to do, but it's really hard in the modern world. I remember in one of my early assignments in Vietnam, I went to meet a sort of leading pro-democracy dissident and, you know, tried out some sort of amateur Wikipedia, you know, James Bond counter-espionage stuff, like getting the bus there and then a motorbike taxi there and then crossing the road and going through a back alley. And then I get to the restaurant to meet this guy, and there's like 5 goons sitting at the next table with the trademark like green police socks. And the guy was like, oh, don't worry about it. Like, these guys follow me everywhere. So if it is a dissident, often they're under way more surveillance than you. But the problem now is electronic surveillance, right? And even 10 years ago, places like Vietnam, Turkey, they're just buying off-the-shelf products, mostly from Western companies, that can hack your phone and your computer really easily. And actually, encryption doesn't make a difference, because once they're on your computer or your phone, they can see everything. And if you want to be totally safe, you have to be able to Snowden and be off the internet, basically. As soon as you use a Chinese mobile phone provider or you log on to the Wi-Fi, anything like that, you know, pretty much everything is compromised. And so you have to face this balance between protecting people, but also just practically doing your job. And it is really, really difficult.
Yeah, you mentioned the internet, so I'll turn to the audience for questions soon, but we haven't brought up social media and the role of social media by these authoritarian regimes. Kirsten, perhaps if I could bring you in, if any thoughts on how the governments that you're experienced with are using social media as a tool against reporters?
Well, the Singapore government has got very, very sophisticated with social media. They definitely have some sort of PR firm managing their pages because, like, the Prime Minister's Facebook page is beautiful. What a nice guy, what a lovely guy. He goes for walks in parks and, like, shakes hands with people in hawker centers and just drinks coffee like everybody else. And, like, what a lovely guy. But, you know, it's kind of... his wife, however, Facebook, she's terrible at it. And she just... It's really kind of interesting because then there's also all these rumors of like for example, when New Narrative was in the papers and people are saying we should be hanged, there was this rumor going around how many of them are real people, how many of them are told to say these things to make it look like they're essentially astroturfing to make it look like this is what the Singaporean people want. It's not entirely clear. It's very difficult to prove, especially when data and there's no freedom of information, so you can't demand government ministries to cough up information about what they're spending on and if they're hiring these people. So there's just generally a lot of kind of this uncertainty about how much of what you're seeing is real. But yeah, then in Singapore, then we also have weird things of like Facebook being used in the whole opposite direction when the Prime Minister's own siblings take to Facebook to say he's abusing his power. And you could never have printed that anywhere else. And then his siblings go on Facebook because they're like, we don't trust the Straits Times. And it's really odd because it's such a bizarre, surreal thing when they say that, because the Straits Times is technically now seen as not trustworthy because of their father's legacy of clamping down on media. But now this whole thing plays out on Facebook, and so it's kind of really very interesting to see how both sides are essentially fighting over this online space.
Anybody else on the panel like to expand on the role of social media? Any thoughts?
Yeah, I guess before the story of Cambridge Analytica came out, before the idea of St. Petersburg troll factories in Russia, and I was seeing weird things in Twitter 2, 3, 4 years ago where you cover a story and suddenly you get this barrage of just really nasty stuff and really pointed and like, where is this coming from? And there was a suspicion that there must be some like youth group supporting Erdogan who was doing things, or there was a Gaddafi group or something like that. And before the 2016 election in the U.S., I just remember coming under fire from Duterte supporters when reporting on the war on drugs there and people. So this is weaponized. And it's so funny because you'll kind of do your thing, you'll report your stories, you'll do your little tweets, and then one day a tweet just gets mauled. You just get this kind of avalanche of anger, but then it disappears just as quickly because whoever's directing it has moved the target to something else. So this is just kind of a fact of life now. It's something that we deal with. The problematic thing is if personal details are being published and personal information, and it's putting people in harm's way. And that's what you hope to stay away from right now.
I think we do need to, in a way, accept that this is a fact of life in the modern world. And we can't just wring our hands and say it's terrible. I mean, obviously, when social media first took off, everyone said, oh, this is the answer. It's going to bring democracy and goodness, and everyone will be helping each other. And that hasn't worked out. But it's just a fact of life. It's a way people communicate. Before I lived in Hong Kong, I was living in Indonesia, where I was the FT correspondent there. And it's one of the biggest users of Facebook and Twitter in the world in terms of the number of posts people make. And people have done good things, they've done horrible things. Some people blame it for the rise of radical Islam in Indonesia. But, it's just a conversation space. And you can talk about it being weaponized. But I think maybe some people are trying to weaponize it. The only way people are going to fight back is with more posts on social media. And I think you kind of have to trust people and not go around looking for scapegoats. Just do our job and trust that, people will have a debate.
I would just add that, I agree with everything that's been said, but I think it's also important to look at the role of these platforms. In this part of the world, it's really Facebook. Because I think all of the different platforms have different points of view on the notion of neutrality, as we've seen with Facebook over the past couple of weeks. I think Facebook acknowledged, I believe for the first time, that they don't see themselves as a neutral platform, even though they had standards for content, dating back to their early years. I think the way these platforms manage their relationships with these authoritarian governments is going to become increasingly important, which we're already seeing, and the way they manage, their own restrictions on content, like everything from harassment of women to targeted harassment of like ethnic minorities, like we're seeing in Myanmar and Sri Lanka. So I think that's it's not necessarily. I mean, I agree that it's a fact of life, but there's also like that's a big company that I think should be held accountable as well as the troll armies and everybody else involved in this issue.
Just on a practical level for the journalism students and the younger journalists in the room, in my experience, the training on information safety and information security and on personal safety having to do with the web within most news organizations is not sufficient. In some cases, our editors, who are excellent, accomplished journalists, their reporting days were before there were cell phones, in many cases. And so I found the most effective way here is sort of like self-teaching. Mega hosted an information security workshop for a bunch of her peers in Beijing. I think it's something that as a journalistic community in various areas, you can work on together. What are the best practices? How are your sources getting found out? What VPN are you using? Are you using one of those cell phone stopping bags when you're in meetings? Like, this is all stuff that you probably need to get from other reporters at this point. So ask the people around you. There's no guidelines because it's all happening right now.
Definitely, there are different sort of contexts. So, for example, in Singapore, one of the worries, I don't think it's yet happened to journalists, but definitely to activists. One of the worries is that so many offenses are classified as arrestable offenses, which means that if you do get called in for interrogation, you don't actually need to be arrested, but if you get called in for an interrogation, the police are allowed to search and search your home and seize your things without warrant. So the worry is that, in 2016, they called in 2 activists claiming that they had breached election advertising rules by posting on Facebook on cooling off day, which is the day before voting. They said they breached the law. They called in for interrogation, and then they went and took all their computers and their phones and their hard drives, all the electronics that they could get their hands on their home, and just kind of confiscated it and sat on it. And there is absolutely no guarantee of what they're doing with your computer once they've got it. And obviously then encryption doesn't help anything when they have the actual machine. So that's one of the concerns in Singapore as well, like, about basically deleting things securely, storing them on encrypted drives. Maybe your drive shouldn't be in your home. Where should you put it? And all these kinds of things as well.
Okay, so
Rebecca from CNN. This is for Mega and Emily, specifically. So on the subject of technology, I'm interested in how facial technology is being used so widely in China. And I'm interested, as we heard about Ivan's emails being hacked and Ben's assistants being followed personally, but now it's so much more advanced in China. They can see your every move. There's a CCTV camera on every corner. Is that something that's changing your behavior as reporters? Are you more worried about being out on the street and then tracking your behavior patterns and watching who you're meeting up with and sources, things like that? And going forward, what advice would you give to journalists working in China and other places like that in terms of how to operate?
Have you guys started wearing disguises?
So I haven't started to think about it in my normal life in Beijing. I don't know if that's going to change. There have been cases that have been reported in like local press reports and stuff like that where people have been arrested just based on being somewhere and having been caught on a facial recognition camera. And like to me, like this is like everything in China. It's not that facial recognition technology is like inherently bad or anything. It's just that you have a court system where they convict 99.9% of people, right? So it's like the issue is rule of law, right? So and the lack of checks on how that technology is used. So I think as it's becoming more widely used in most of China, it is definitely going to present a problem. For me personally, I haven't really thought about it in terms of my reporting except for the reporting I did last year in Xinjiang. And like, yeah, I did have this weird incident. Like, basically in Xinjiang, if you go to a petrol station, you have to give your passport and submit to like a facial scan or like an iris scan. So I went to check out a petrol station so I could write about what it was like. So I walked into the gas station after giving my passport and everything, and then I kind of poked around and took some pictures. And as I was walking away, one of the women who worked at the gas station was like, wait a second, like, you can't do that. Like, you can't, like, 你不能乱拍照, right? Like, you can't just, like, take pictures of whatever you want. So then I made up some cockamamie story about, being a foreign student or something like that. And then she looked at me like she didn't really believe me, but she couldn't really do anything about it. So then I got into a taxi, and I took the taxi across town to where my hotel was. And as soon as I got out of the cab, I was approached by 3 police officers who asked to see my ID and, asked what I was doing there and this and that. And, it just made me think, like, how would that have been possible if it wasn't for some kind of tech element there? Like, somebody would have had to communicate the license plate of the car that I had gotten into or something like that. And in Kashgar, it's like, you really feel it because the cameras are everywhere. Like, you can just see them, and you do have this feeling of being watched all the time. So I guess, like, I mean, I can't prove that it was because of facial recognition or anything like that, or even because of surveillance cameras, but it's just like, even the possibility that that could be it does change the way that you work, I think. And like, probably in the future, I would think about that, before meeting somebody in public. Like, I would try to meet them somewhere where, I would know that there wouldn't be cameras, which is what I did in Kashgar.
Yeah, I think the calculus for every story is changing. Like, is this story worth sending someone to jail? Is this the range of stories and the range of reporting environments where you have to ask that is expanding? The biggest practical change is ditching your phone. It's obviously not sufficient because of things like facial recognition. Like, when you check into your hotel, they've got you. When you buy a train ticket, they've got you. When you walk down the street, they've got you. But if you're looking to lose people, what people in Beijing are doing now is using those Faraday bags. So when I meet with diplomats, usually for lunch, someone will bring one out. Everyone will put all of their phones. That's just good manners, and seal it up. And I mean, you never know if they secretly have a third phone. But this is what we're doing. From a news logistics point of view, it's a bit tough because, like, my company tracks me via my phone, so you lose the ability to be tracked. But that's what we're doing. When I go to a small town now, we'll sometimes leave it for several hours, which is very uncomfortable for anyone who's addicted to their phone.
I mean, I take a sometimes different approach most of the time when I was in Vietnam and when I'm in the mainland and other places too, because I actually want to be open, Often in China, in Vietnam, in other places, they'll accuse you in Turkey of being a foreign spy and this or that, and I want it to be clear, I'm not. I'm going here to talk to this business person or that human rights person or whatever it may be, and not every story is sensitive. But I quite like the idea of being open and being out there, and when they ask you, it's pretty likely they'll be able to find out what you're doing anyway. That's my view, and so I quite like the idea of being open, not having anything hidden, unless it is really super sensitive and there is some obvious reason why someone's in danger. Because my experience, even in Vietnam 6-7 years ago, with much less money than China and much worse technology, they can track you everywhere pretty easily. And when in China, you have to check your passport in every time you take a train, flight, every time you go to a hotel, and now they're taking a picture as well. So I think it's quite good to be open.
Oh, sorry.
I agree. I mean, I think our only defense is to just, hey, we're reporters. I'm not going to sneak into some place. I'll stick out in most countries that I'm traveling in and working in, and the only protection that I can kind of create is to say, this is what I'm doing. I'm going to ask the government your opinion on this human rights question, and kind of tell you what I've learned. And again, we're not spies. They have to know that this is what we're doing, and it is the only kind of defense you really have, short of trying to protect sources or whatever. But if it's getting to that stage, we're not going to outsmart police states, okay? They've got vast resources. if anything, seeing the paranoia becomes part of the story. You know, finding out that, wow, they were waiting for me at the hotel. What does that tell you about what's going on in that country? And then just because they're police states with vast resources doesn't mean they're smart. They make stupid mistakes, and it can be really funny, and it shows the lengths of the paranoia and the extent that folks go to try to, the absurdity of lying. You know, somebody was citing the CNN advertisement, you know, apples versus bananas and stuff like that. You get into this doublespeak in some countries, and that becomes your story. The challenge is if you're living in that day in and day out, which unfortunately it sounds like you're going through right now, and then that pressure is on your family, on your life, on your income, and that's a burden that hopefully we don't all have to face sometime. But good on you for standing strong.
I think it's interesting that sometimes the sort of high-tech side of it, being able to use new technology to trace people, I'm not sure if that's always what they want to do. I remember when I was a correspondent in Beijing in the 90s, the idea was not so much to track you, but to make you aware that they were following you so that you didn't actually do your job. That was what they really wanted you to do. So they were very low-tech at that time. We would come out of the diplomatic compound, there'd be a guy with a red helmet, which you'd put on and follow you on a moped, you know, and it was very clear who he was. You pick up the phone, exactly. You pick up the phone, you hear this clunk, you know, and okay. But it was smart, and it worked, because in that sense, it's not so much the idea of where I'm going. You say, I'm not going to now go and meet this person if this guy's behind me, if that was the case point. And I think they use that very cleverly. And sometimes the low-tech work actually works better than I don't know, espionage of the degree we're at now.
Final word, Megan.
Oh, sorry. I just wanted to tell, I just remembered another anecdote. But yeah, like I'll keep it brief. But like when I was in Kashgar, I was trying to speak to this guy who was the proprietor of a restaurant that was near this like secret prison, basically. And so I went to the restaurant, and you know we had a chat about nothing for like 30 minutes, and then I was like, okay, and then he was like, I'll give you directions on where to go next. So then he took me outside of the restaurant. We walked kind of around the corner, and I could tell that he was taking me someplace where he thought that there was no electronic eavesdropping or cameras. And then we had the real conversation there. So I think that sort of taught me that the people who are like in this, that they're living in it, they learn the kind of ways around it. You do have to rely on them, like their knowledge, I think.
I just need to call FCC President Florence to the stage to close the conference, because we're almost on drinks time. While we wait for Florence, could we please thank our panel very warmly for that great session? Thank you.
Yeah, good evening, everyone. Apologies, first of all, for not being there this morning. I just back from a week assignment in Vietnam, and I arrived this morning, and that's why I'm reading some notes as well. So, first of all, I think I'd like, or maybe we take this away, sure. Yeah, I'd like to highlight, how interesting and inspiring and important this conference has been. I think the variety of views and experiences were really very insightful. For me, hearing from Maria Ressa and the incredibly courageous work she does in the Philippines, Kirsten, who is taking really risk as well, I think. And I was about to tell you, be careful, you're being filmed and you will be on YouTube. We're very good at petition in the FCC, but I really would not like to launch another petition for you. So, I mean, standing for genuine journalism in a place like Singapore is admirable as well. And by the way, Kirsten will be a speaker at the club next Tuesday if you want to join us and hear more. Also, Selina from HKO1, who mentioned the way the editors now could quietly kill a story, even though she doesn't yet receive clear messages. I mean, all of the challenges we've just heard about, I think, are very important, and it is essential that journalists and journalism questions not just the world, but also its own trade and where it's going, basically questions itself. And it's this kind of gathering that can really serve the purpose. And we believe at the FCC that we are the ideal place to host these debates and conversations. And I would like, obviously, to encourage anyone in this room who is not yet an FCC member to join. And I should let you know that journalists, there is a very generous promotion scheme for correspondents and journalists. So please consider joining. And of course now, the last thing before I declare the bar downstairs open is to thank you all involved. Of course, you have signed up because the fact that we have such a nice crowd make it even more successful. The panelists, we really had an amazing lineup of very interesting people. Some of them traveled from far. Amazing amount of work from the staff of the FCC. You may have noticed it's not a normal Saturday in the club.